So we're going to get straight to the action. First game of the week. It is Pittsburgh Steelers at the Baltimore Ravens. And this game, it just doesn't feel like it deserves to be on the Saturday night at this slot. The Steelers, they need a win to get in, and they need a Buffalo Bills or Jacksonville Jaguars loss. It's really tricky to kind of see how much the Ravens care about this game. Lamar Jackson's going to be sitting, which puts Tyler Huntley in line to start. We know that Tyler Huntley over the last few years has been kind of hyper focused on tight ends at times. So, do we see Isaiah Likely starting? Personally, my gut feel is that Isaiah Likely isn't going to be out there that much because the Ravens feel like he is an important player to what we need to get going until Mark Andrews is back. I think that you could look at somebody like Charlie Kohler as a long shot for this game. I think you could look at Melvin Gordon as somebody. If you're playing the showdown over 2 game slate on the Saturday, those are both viable players. In terms of other Ravens players, Zay Flowers hasn't practiced all week. I think it's very unlikely that he's going to be playing. I think that Odell Beckham, there's plenty of people talking about how many receptions Odell Beckham needs to unlock his next bonus. You can see on the screen, he needs 5 receptions for 250,000. The Ravens paid Odell Beckham a $15 million contract. They do not care about giving him 5 receptions when they paid him $15 million with the hopes of winning a Super Bowl. So that's one which I feel like is noise. I would be very surprised if Beckham plays. The Nelson Aguilar one, though, he needs 58 yards for 250,000. That's the kind of one which I can see happening. As Rory says in the chat, forgive me, don't care who wins. For the Ravens, this is a game where if they lose, okay, the Steelers possibly end up in the playoffs. The Steelers, they need a win and the Bills to lose. So it's kind of one of those, like, the likely scenario is that the Steelers or the Bills end up in. And if the Ravens beat the Steelers, then the Bills are less likely to get in. So there are pluses and cons either side of it. The Ravens just want to get out there healthy. On the Steelers side of things, I mean, Mason Rudolph, he's been better than Kenny Pickett. He, among all quarterbacks with 50 dropbacks or more this season, he rates second in EPA per dropback, first in completion percentage over expected, first in passer rating, and first in yards per attempt at 10.5. He is getting the downfield passing game going in a way that Kenny Pickett just hasn't whatsoever all season. And you can blame part of that on Matt Kennedy. You can blame it on all sorts of things. But the simple fact is, right now, the Steelers' offense has been watchable for the first time in months. George Pickens, 326 yards, 2 touchdowns in his last 2 games. He's gotten going. It seems like him and Mason Rudolph have a good connection. Najee Harris, 200 yards and 3 touchdowns in his last 2 games. He's getting going. He seems to have found some life. I think they'll possibly prefer Jalen Warren in this game because the kind of back which Jalen Warren is, it just feels similar to the kind of running backs who've had success against the Ravens in recent weeks. You look at Christian McCaffrey, Kyron Williams, and even Devin Achan last week. Guys who are a little bit more explosive is what I feel is going to lend itself to this one. Overall, though, it doesn't feel like a game which you want to get too hung up on. So let's move on to the next Saturday game, and it is the Houston Texans at the Indianapolis Colts. So both teams can win the division with a Jags loss. So whoever wins this game really does have a chance of actually seeing, come Sunday, could they be in with a chance of taking down the AFC South? Indy, their big weakness is they're weak against the run. They allow the 3rd most fantasy points to running back position. Obviously, the Texans, though, they're not exactly a good running offense. Their run offense ranks 30th in DVOA. Devin Singletary has been far better than Dameon Pierce this year. I mean, Dameon Pierce had sort of 58 for 1 last week. He's only scored double digits when he gets touchdowns. Like, he's really just not a player who's been impressive at all over the last few weeks, whereas Singletary, it seems like the team really trusts him now. So I think if you were looking for a player to lean on in this one, Singletary really feels very much in play. On the other side of the ball, Jonathan Taylor, he's had 6 touchdowns in his last 5 games, but he's had 0 games of 100 rushing yards in a game. And the Texans are fairly stout against the run. They rank second best in defensive DVOA against the run, and they haven't given up huge games really there. I think you'd be more looking to see, can Michael Pittman get going? Last week, he only had 7 targets, but still had a 35% target share. And the Texans, they allow 90th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position, but they rank 27th in DVOA against wide receiver ones. It's a position that they've struggled to defend all season. So that's something which I think you could look to take advantage of. If you're looking at a 2 game slate, I think you need to go probably with the CJ Stroud quarterback option, simply because we know he has the highest ceiling out of the 4 quarterbacks on this slate. And then you could pair him with Devin Singletary. You could pair him with Michael Pittman as the bring back. And then I'd probably fade this game and probably try and get a few Steelers position players in there. But ultimately, this game, you can see the over under is at 47.5. But it feels like that this could be a bit of a letdown. I don't know if the Colts are going to be able to push the Texans in the way which we'd like them to. We know the Colts like to play fast, but the Texans, I just feel like they can probably get out in front on this one, be able to defend it a little bit easier. I do think there are a couple of in worth mentioning. Dalton Schultz needs 4 receptions for 250K. That feels very, very achievable. Shout out to Rob. Appreciate you being here late. Devin Singletary needs 73 yards for 250K. These aren't the kind of incentives which the head coaches are going to go out of their way to get. But it feels like that they're just going to be part of the game plan as they go along. If they are attainable, then they're just going to cede a little bit more volume to those guys. So I'd be completely fine with that. But ultimately, yeah, for me, the Saturday 2 game slate doesn't hold much interest. Play a little bit of showdown, but the Sunday game slate is a bit better. What I need you to do, you are here. It is week 18. I know how much you love fantasy football. If you're watching a week 18 preview and I need your help, click on that subscribe button down below. The off season, we dominate the off season. We thrive in the off season. We've got so much content coming. The reason I'm solo running this tonight is because Rich is in the film lab working on the rookie guide. We have mock drafts coming soon. We have all kinds of Dynasty content. The best ball drafts, they'll be coming later in the off season. Hit that subscribe button now so you don't miss out on great content. Let's move on. Cleveland at Cincinnati. This is not a great game on paper whatsoever. You can see when it came to the notes on screen, I didn't know what to write, because what is about 2 teams who have nothing to play for? The Browns, they've clinched the 5th seed. There's no chance of change with that whatsoever. So there's no point in putting players like Myles Garrett and Amari Cooper out there, who are both banged up at the minute. Joe Flacco getting rested. Joe Flacco's gone from sitting at home on the couch to now, a matter of weeks later, is being rested ahead of the playoffs. Nobody saw this coming, and he is the comeback player of the year for me. So I think we should probably expect to see the Browns rest a few of their players. But in general, the whole resting players things gets a little overdone, because you still need about 45 players on an active game day roster. You're not really going to be able to rest more than a few players. It's kind of how they get utilized. So Elijah Moore had a concussion last week. I think it would be sensible of the Browns to just rest him. No sense in pushing him back out there. So then are we going to see more Cedric Tillman? I think Cedric Tillman is definitely a player that I wouldn't mind taking some dart throws on this weekend. Since week 11, he's averaged 4.4 targets per game. And yes, he is going to be potentially catching balls from Jeff Driscoll, who last started a game in week 3 of 2020 for the Denver Broncos. So if you have a strong feeling about Jeff Driscoll being adequate, then okay, you can lay into the passing game a little bit strong in this one, possibly, because the Bengals, we know their defense has looked really poor over the last month. They haven't really been able to stop anyone. But Jeff Driscoll versus Jake definitely doesn't really get the blood pumping. T. Higgins and Jamar Chase, there is so little reason to risk playing those two. T. Higgins is going to be a free agent, probably franchise tag or tagged and traded, something like that this offseason. Jamar Chase, why would you put a player out there who is your superstar who you would try to build around? If he got injured in this meaningless game, when you can't even spoil the party for the Browns, there is just no sense in it at all. So I can't imagine a scenario where I play either T. Higgins or Jamar Chase this week. The running back positions, though, is a little bit more interesting. Joe Mixon needs 2 touchdowns for a 100K bonus. Maybe they could lean into that if they were in a position to do so. Chase Brown, the coaches this week were talking about how much they really like Chase Brown and how they want Chase Brown to develop into a player who can be a big part of the offense next year. He had a 16% opportunity share last week after averaging 30% over the previous 4 games. So it felt maybe like game script and other bits were just going away from him, a little bit banged up, but I wouldn't be surprised if he got plenty of work this week. Maybe we see players like Pierre Strong, Harrison Bryant, those kind of guys. Tanner Hudson, he's averaged 32.6 yards per game since week 9, but this Browns defense, they've allowed the second fewest fantasy points to the tight end position. So it's not like, even if you take out some of the quality starters, it's not like you're just going to be able to walk all over them. Let's move on to the next game. Tampa Bay at Carolina, 38-point over-under. This one's simple for the Bucs. Win gives them the NFC South, and lose, and that's where the nightmare scenarios start cropping up. There are loads of incentives on this one, but I think that it doesn't really matter to the Bucs. Really, they need to go out there. They need to stomp on a Carolina team who are coming off their worst performance of the season. And when you talk about the Panthers, there have been plenty of bad performances this year, but that was hands down the worst one. So yeah, Baker Mayfield, though, he's been a top 15 quarterback in his last 4 games, 13th in pass yards per game at 244. The Panthers, they have been very frugal against quarterback position, against the wide receiver and the tight end position, bottom 5 in fantasy points allowed to all of those positions. But part of that's because there's such a weak run defense that it leads to situations where teams can just run all over them and they don't need their quarterbacks to pass on them. They don't need their wide receivers to go out and have 300-yard games. So it'll be interesting to see how the Bucs approach this one because they've not been afraid to just keep passing heavily at times. I think that you can absolutely load up Rachaad White coming off his worst fantasy finish since week 1. He was the RB38 last week. But when the teams met a few weeks, he had 20 touches for 84 and a touchdown on the ground in week 13 against the Panthers. So this is a kind of get right spot for him. Mike Evans, he's had 16 touchdowns this year. He just feels like a lock to score a touchdown in pretty much every single game. Chris Godwin, he's been the wide receiver 11 over the last 3 games, averaging 9.8 targets. So if you were playing on DraftKings this week, and if you're looking at games which you can kind of really take advantage of, one way on icky slates like this is to onslaught an offense, go, okay, right, well, I really believe in Baker Mayfield this week. I believe in Rachaad White. I believe in one of Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. And maybe just go, okay, right, well, I'm just going to accept there are a lot of games that are going to hit the under rather than going over the total they're supposed to. So let's just lean into that and just really bet on this game and onslaught it, go a bit heavier than we might normally do so, and just know that a lot of the people playing this week won't be that comfortable going that heavily on a single game. On the other side, Chuba Hubbard, he's averaging 86 scrimmage yards per game over the last 6. He had 25 touches for 105 scrimmage yards and 2 touchdowns when we met in week 13. Already mentioned it, but Bryce Young, like last week, was just awful after he really seemed to be picking up a little bit of momentum. Jonathan Mingo placed on IR. I mean, there's nobody you need to play from the Panthers side. You're getting to bring back some of this one. Let's move on to the next game, which is the Atlanta Falcons at the New Orleans Saints. So the Falcons, they could win the NFC South with a win, if Tampa Bay lose to Carolina, which doesn't feel too likely, but we see funky things happen in week 18. For Falcons, it's kind of division or bust. The Packers, they could claim the seventh seed, beating the Falcons in the tiebreaker if the Falcons lose to the Saints. So really, yeah, all on the line here. Are we going to see Arthur Smith finally go, okay, let's lean into these offensive studs who have spent huge draft capital on and unleash them finally? It would be beautiful if in week 18, after 17 weeks of us banging our heads against the table for fantasy football purposes, Arthur Smith goes, right, now let's give 20 touches to Bijan Robinson. Let's give 2 red zone targets to Kyle Pitts and he catches both of them. Drake London, have a 100-yard game. Let's see what those fantasy nerds think about this. And I think, it's very unlikely that's going to happen. But there is a realm of possibility where 1 or 2 of these players for the Falcons can have a really good game against the Saints, because the Saints defense has been struggling lately. They're a very banged up team. And Bijan, he's had 17.5 touches per game since week 10, averaging 15.3 points per game, which isn't obviously the most impressive number, but it's been enough at times, and the good has propped that up. And then there's been some bad games that's dragged that down. Kyle Pitts, he's tight end 14 on the year. He's only had 3 touchdowns and 577 receiving yards. Barely got more points on the season than Jonnu Smith. So I'm not massively keen on that one. But the Saints, they're stronger against running backs, they're stronger against wide receivers than they are against the tight end position. So I could possibly talk myself into it. And then, on the other side of this game, the Saints, they need to win and have the Bucks lose to the Panthers. The only other path they have is if they win, the Bucks win, Seattle lose to Arizona, and Green Bay lose to Chicago, then the Saints will sneak in as the 7th seed. So I think, you just want to keep that simple and just go with the winning in and have the Bucks lose to the Panthers. Let's say Juwan Johnson, 3 touchdowns in his last 3 games. The Falcons, they give up the 7th most fantasy points to the tight end position. Juwan Johnson, it seems like he's kind of put it together over training camp. We heard that Juwan Johnson was balling out and looked really good. And then he got into the season, seemed to be a bit banged up and never really put it together. But right now, Derek Carr, over the last few weeks, he's averaging 17.9 points per game since week 14. And he seems to be trusting Juwan Johnson. So that's a stack which I don't mind playing. I think you could take that stack, throw Chris Olave on there, who, since week 10 is averaging 16.4 PPR points per game. Before that point, he was averaging 12.4 points per game. Alvin Kamara is fine. The Falcons defense is ranked 8th best overall, so it's not really the most ideal matchup. But we've seen at times that Kamara can get there on sheer volume alone. But I would prefer to play the Juwan Johnson side of this game with Bijan Robinson, really. Those are the 2 main guys that I would like to get into. If you are here watching this 20 minutes into a week 18 matchup preview, hit that like button. I need you to help me this week. It's tough sledding out here in week 18. Jacksonville Jaguars at Tennessee, 40-point over-under. The Jags, it's simple. You beat the Titans, win the AFC South. Lose and everything becomes a real nightmare. They need the Steelers and the Broncos both to lose. For the Jags, it kind of feels like everything's on the table here, because this season has become such a nightmare for them, really, hasn't it? It's like the Trevor Lawrence injuries, the Christian Kirk injuries, the Zay Jones injuries, Trevor Etienne just becoming a complete non-factor for most of the second half of the season. But the one thing which is really interesting here, nobody expected Christian Kirk to be back playing before deep into the playoffs was the word. So DraftKings leaves him at the stone cold minimum pricing that wide receivers can be, $3,000. And now he's out here, he's practicing. He practiced again today. It sounds like he's doing well in practice. And it sounds very possible that Christian Kirk could be out there this weekend. And if Christian Kirk is out there against a Tennessee Titans defense, frankly, awful against the pass all year, then at 3K, we are looking for absolute minimal amounts of returns for him. Christian Kirk could be the single player that decides how this game, how this slate of games on DraftKings is going to go this week. At that price, if Christian Kirk gets 5 catches for 40 yards, then he's going to pay off. Every week, we're looking for that player below 4K who's going to unlock lineups. I would expect Christian Kirk to be a very popular player this week, but for good reason, because the Titans, they are very poor against the pass. They've given up lots of points this season. They've allowed the 7th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. In DVOA, they rank 31st against wide receiver ones, 29th against wide receiver 22s. Zay Jones is banged up and unlikely to play. Jamal Agnew is not going to play. We know that already. So it is going to be Christian Kirk, Calvin Ridley, and Evan Ingram. The Titans as well, they've allowed the 9th most fantasy points to the slot receiver position. So everything just stacks up in Christian Kirk's favor. In terms of Calvin Ridley, yes, it's been up and down. I mean, you look at his last 5 games, wide receiver 44, 44, 8, and 50. But when he played the Titans in week 11, he had 31.1 points because the Titans cannot stop the pass. I think when you look at the Titans and you say, okay, there's nothing for them to play, there is nothing for them to play for, but they get to play a division rival. And we know Mike Vrabel isn't going to just roll over and let the season end. We know that he's going to coach his team hard, and spoiling the party for the Jags would be a good end to the season, particularly in Tennessee for his team. So I would expect the Titans to come out and play tough. I think that we can look at what the Titans have going on offense, and it's going to be pretty miserable. Will Levis isn't expected to play due to the ankle injury that he sustained last week, which I believe was on the other ankle to the ankle he'd injured previously. So, do we see Ryan Tannehill out there? I mean, Ryan Tannehill looked pretty awful last week, or do we see Malik Davis? Possibly. Either way, I think the only way you can play this game is really through DeAndre Hopkins. The Jags, they have the 6th best run defense in DVOA. They've been very good there all year. They'll have a 16th amount of fantasy points to the running back position, but they'll have a 10th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. DeAndre Hopkins, he needs 39 receiving yards for 250K, 7 receptions for another 250K, 2 touchdowns for another 250K. So there's plenty of reason to think, okay, DeAndre Hopkins is in Tennessee next year. Let's keep him happy. Let's feed him the ball. And why would you not? Because Traylon Burks has won double-digit game all year. I think you look at Chigozie Okonkwo, he's had some decent games recently, but nothing too incredible. So, yeah, this is another game where I think you could look at going heavy on one side of things. You could play Trevor Lawrence, you could play Calvin Ridley and Christian Kirk, even Evan Ingram, who has been, he's had the quietest 100 reception tight end season of all time. He's only had 3 touchdowns, which is what's probably really made it quite quiet. But he's been an absolute volume hog, and without Zay Jones, I think that can absolutely continue too. So yeah, I think you could go with the triple stack on the Jag side of it. Now let's move over to a game that's not so attractive. New York Jets at the New England Patriots. This one, the overs come down from 31 as I had it here down to 30.5 already. Is Trevor Simeon versus Bailey Zappi, which nobody really wants that. I don't think that either of the coaches want to be around this game. Garrett Wilson, he's not been a top 20 wide receiver in the last 3 games. And part of that is that he was just simply playing better with Zach Wilson out there. But it's been good news for Brees Hall, top 3 RB in 3 of the last 4 games. But it's going to be tough sledding for him because he faced a run defense who rank best overall in DVOA. So playing this one becomes really difficult. I mean, you're looking at a low over under. Yes, you can say both running backs, Zeke Elliott averaging 16.5 points over the last 5, Brees averaging 25 PPR points over his last 4 games. Both of them have really projectable volume. But outside of that, what is there? Like Demario Douglas, 11 touches in the last 2 games. Hunter Henry went 7 for 66 and a touchdown last week, 2 touchdowns a week before. The Jets do struggle against the tight end position, but I'd be very wary about having more than one player from this game in the lineup. I think it's okay to take shots at one-offs, but that's about as far as I'd want to go into it. Sorry about that little mic issue. Minnesota at Detroit, 45.5 over under. I mean, this is one of the bigger over unders of the weekend. Definitely one of the games which feels more interesting on paper, even though it's Nick Mullins versus Jared Goff. I mean, Jaron Reed just didn't look good. I think that that was one of those kind of situations for Vikings. They've faced a lot of adversity at the QB position this year, but the ping ponging back and forth between it really hasn't helped anything. The Lions, they could get the second seed overall, but they need both the Cowboys to lose and the Eagles to lose. And when you talk about that, you're saying, okay, well, the Cowboys, they're playing the 13, 14-point favorites in that game. So it's pretty unlikely. But Dan Campbell, Captain Football guy, he says he wants to start his starters. And I imagine that he probably will, unless this game kind of gets out of hand. The Vikings, they need a win to stay alive. That's, even if they win, it's possible that they're not going to get in. The Vikings need to win. They need the Seahawks to lose to the Cardinals, and the Packers to lose to the Bears, and the Saints to lose to the Falcons. So I think we all know that Minnesota is probably going to be not busy in January. In terms of incentives in this game, Alexander Mattison needs 74 rushing yards to earn $250,000. But I mean, the Vikings, they've turned this backfield over to Ty Chandler. Ty Chandler has taken it and run with it recently. But the Lions, they rank dead last in fantasy points allowed. They've been excellent against the position all year. So I don't think I'd be wanting to play that side of things. I think I'd much rather look at Justin Jefferson and KJ Osborne. Justin Jefferson was 6 for 141 and 1 last time Nick Mullins started. KJ Osborne went 5 for 95 and 1. Jordan Addison, I mean, I love Jordan Addison. We're big fans of Jordan Addison, Fantasy Sanctuary, but he's banged up. He's really struggling out there, and I think he is a guy who just needs to get to the off season. On the Lions side of things, it's pretty straightforward. I mean, Amon-Ra St. Brown, the Vikings allow the 6th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. Sam Laporta, yes, the Vikings have been fairly good against tight end position, but Sam Laporta, he only needs 1 reception to break the rookie tight end record of 81 catches in a year. That feels absolutely nailed on. The one play that I think is kind of sneaky good here is possibly David Montgomery. David Montgomery tends to see much more of a ball when we end up in these neutral scripts. And this feels like a game which could be fairly neutral. And I won't be surprised if David Montgomery gets 2 touchdowns this weekend. That's one which I'll be writing up in the betting slips that go into our Discord. So, yep, 30 minutes in, week 18. Help me. We are so close to 1,500 subscribers. Hit that subscribe button. So much rookie content, so much pre-draft content, so much best ball content. Chicago at Green Bay. This one is a game which feels particularly interesting, as Pat says in the chat. Jordan Love, QB1. Quite possibly. I mean, there's some reason to believe that this could be one of the games which actually provides a lot of fantasy value. So the Packers, they need a win, and then they'll be in. It could be possible if they lose, but they need the Saints to lose, to the Falcons, the Vikings to lose to the Lions, and the Seahawks to lose to the Cardinals. So it's asking quite a lot, really. The Bears, the Bears getting a chance to spoil Green Bay's party. This is very reminiscent of the Lions last year, going into Green Bay on the last day and having a chance to ruin Green Bay's party, and they did it. And now you're talking about a Chicago team who is absolutely resurgent of late, whose defense has played fantastic over the last few games. Justin Fields looks like a different player at times. Yes, he's still making some head-scratching throws, but DJ Moore has been excellent, career high 9 touchdowns after for years struggling to get into the end zone. And he's been straight up brilliant. I think that looking at this from a stacking perspective, you can go Justin Fields, DJ Moore, and then 2 Packers players, because on the Packers side of things, Jay has been incredible of late. Christian Watson, it sounded like he almost played in week 17, but just missed out. This is a game where they can't afford not to play everyone. I would be very surprised if Luke Musgrave didn't return as well as Christian Watson. So the Packers need everyone out there because, with a loss, it's probably not going to happen. Aaron Jones looked really good last weekend, but the Bears defense, they've really kind of clamped down of late how many fantasy points they've been giving up. They've been, over the last 5 games, they have been one of the top 6 teams against the run. They've been one of the top 3 teams against the pass. So, yeah, there's sneaky potential for this game to fall flat on its face, but there's also plenty of potential for this game to turn into a good one. And the motivation factor, even though the Bears can't really do anything, they can't ruin their own draft slot because we've already locked up the number 1 overall pick over because of the Panthers. And this is a coaching staff that are trying desperately to keep their jobs. So I feel like there's a good chance that they do want to go in there in the Green Bay and just ruin everything they can. Philly at New York Giants. The Eagles, their only path to the 2 seed is a Dallas loss. And we'll get onto the Dallas game shortly, but, they're playing the Commanders. If Dallas lose, then, yeah, they don't deserve the 2 seed. The Eagles, things just went atrocious against the Cardinals. You cannot go and play. Well, it didn't even go. It was at home, and they lost to a Cardinals team, and it never even felt particularly close. Like, the Cardinals kind of just did what they wanted all day. And it's a culmination of the fact that the Eagles, their defense is awful this year. They'll have most QB and wide receiver fantasy points. They rank in DVOA 28th against the pass, 19th against the run. Their defensive line, which is supposed to be a strength of the team and kind of where their identity is, it's just not there. Like, they're not managing to get anywhere close to the production that they used to. Jalen Hurts has hit a bit of regression, but it was kind of inevitable at some point. Obviously, Rich talked this week about how many points Jalen Hurts is getting from the QB sneak. And I do think we don't need to worry about Jalen Hurts' fantasy value. he's going through a slump. But that's kind of sustaining him at the minute. And in any games where DeAndre Swift gets away and gets some touchdowns, then it's going to be difficult for Jalen Hurts to really put up the points. And the Giants, they are ninth in fantasy points allowed to the running back position. They allow the second highest yards per carry to running backs at 4.6 yards per game. They allow top 9 fantasy points to the position. So there's a reason to believe that perhaps DeAndre Swift gets back on track here, but it's not an easy click. I think I would prefer to take shots at the wide receiver core. The Giants, they allow the 5th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position, and the Eagles allow the most. You look at the fact that Darius Slayton finally got going for the Giants last week. He had 4 for 106 and 1. And it was the first time all season the Giants had a wide receiver finish inside like the top 12. He finishes the wide receiver 8. Tyrod, he had 6 for 40 on the ground, finished as QB 11 overall. And what we saw from him was just that he was pushing downfield much more than we saw from Tommy Cutlets. Tommy Cutlets, it wasn't as ambitious with the ball, but Tyrod's always been good with that. Darren Waller, it just doesn't seem like we're going to get any of those big tight end performances from him. Since his return, he's had 11 touches in 3 games, 41 yards per game. So I'm not really interested in him. I'd rather take shots at Dallas Goedert, who's played quite nicely. And when you look at the Giants, they have been pretty good against the tight end position all year, allowing the 6th fewest fantasy points to the position. But the way Dallas Goedert often gets there is through screens, it's through design touches. I'd be okay taking shots on that. Saquon Barkley, his last 5 finishes, RB 45, 4, 45, 9, 36. It's so unpredictable what he's going to do. I do think that you can get at the Eagles, but they haven't been particularly given up a lot of receiving yardage to the running back position either. So that's not something that I'd be aggressively targeting. I think there are better running back choices on this slate, and I would rather roll with the wide receivers in that game. How are we doing on the likes? Everybody watching, hit that like button. If you are a sicko, if you need more DFS content, this is the time of year. Your fantasy season, it's over. DFS, this is all we've got left for playoffs. Every single week, my in-depth write-up, it's there. Hit the join button down below. It's like $4.99 a month. Get all our content, all our premium content, all Rich's rookie guides, trade calculators, all my DFS write-ups, the exclusive members-only video that we do on a Saturday where we talk about cash game cores, GPP stacks, everything like that. Less than the price of a cup of coffee per week, and it'll pay for itself in no time. Hit that join button down below. Moving on. LA Rams at the San Francisco 49ers. I mean, this is another game that it's kind of, there's not really a lot of motivation for either side. The Niners, they've locked up the number 1 seed in the conference. The Rams, they sit in the 6th seed and they stay there with a win or a loss. They could drop to the 7th seed depending on other results, but it just doesn't really matter to them. They've locked up their playoff spot. And Sean McVay has been one of the most forward-thinking coaches in terms of how much he likes to rest players. We see it in the preseason. He doesn't want anyone out there at any point. Why we never really got a peek at the Rams sort of cards this year and knew that Kyron Williams was the big plan, or knew how much Puka Nacua was going to be a part of the offense. They don't play him in preseason. They are big on resting, and they've already ruled out Kyron Williams, Tyler Higbee, Cooper Kupp, Matthew Stafford. If you want to start Carson Wentz and try and stack him with DeMarcus Robinson or Ben Skowronek or whoever else is there, be my guest. Perhaps, if you feel strongly this is Ronnie Rivers' game, great. But this doesn't feel like a game that I want any part of. It's worth noting that Puka Nacua needs 4 catches to hit the rookie receiving record and 29 yards for the receiving yards record. I think it's likely that they go out and do that. Sean McVay talked yesterday in his press conference about how they're aware of those and they'd like to get him those records. But it also feels very likely that Puka Nacua goes out in the first drive and gets 4 catches for 40 yards and then sits for the rest of the game, because McVay also talked about being sensible with him at the same time. So if Puka Nacua plays more than 2-3 drives, I'd be very surprised. On the other side of it is the Sam Darnold game. Everybody, all the Sam Darnold slappies who thought that he could push Brock Purdy out of a job this year, now it's your time to feel vindicated on it. It does. Christian McCaffrey's going to play. He hasn't practiced this week. I think it's a calf issue that's kept him out of practice. Last week, when McCaffrey left the game, Elijah Mitchell dominated the touches. He was the player who was seeing all the workload, and it was only when Sam Darnold entered the game later on and the game was put to bed that Jordan Mason got any touches. So perhaps Jordan Mason gets involved later on, but Elijah Mitchell feels like a much safer bet here. And the Rams, they are going to be resting players, but it's also worth noting that they've allowed the second fewest fantasy points to running backs. So it doesn't feel like, there are other games we can probably target and take advantage of over this one. Seahawks at Arizona. It's pretty simple, this one. Seahawks, they've brought it all on themselves, but they need a win and they need the Packers to lose. If they beat the Steelers last week, it would have been much more straightforward. But this Seahawks team, they really don't seem to have the kind of killer instinct this year. So yeah, they need the Packers to lose to the Bears, which I already talked about feeling fairly okay about that. But they need to take care of business against the Cardinals. I really like Kenneth Walker here. He had a 75% opportunity share over the last 3 games. The Cardinals allow the most fantasy to the running back position. In DVOA, they rank 31st against both the pass and the run. And I feel like this is one where Pete Carroll is going to be old school with his approach and really lean into that kind of running back room, and it'll all run through Pete Carroll. I think, you could take shots at really onslaught in this game and hoping that the passing game is where it turns to great sort of results, because, we've seen the Seahawks, their secondary isn't anything special. Jamal Adams kind of has been soft benched. We've seen they give up the 11th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. The Cardinals, we know you can pass on them. They rank 30th in DVOA against wide receiver ones, 31st against wide receiver threes, 6th best against wide receiver twos, however you want to interpret that. And one position which they've kind of struggled with at times has been slot receivers. So maybe we finally get that kind of Jackson Smith and Jig out week. On the other side of this, the Cardinals, nobody expected them to do what they did to the Eagles last week. And it would have been very easy for the Cardinals to just call it a day, put their flip-flops on, and head into the off-season. But what we're seeing is players who are playing for their jobs. There's a lot of players who are on expiring contracts there or playing for the future as part of this kind of rebuild. They have a lot of draft capital, and it sets up nicely for them. Rich in the chat asking, does this set up well for Trey McBride? So Trey McBride, back-to-back quiet games, tight end 21, tight end 11. He's not had 48 yards in either of those games. But yeah, the Seahawks, they rank 17th in fantasy points allowed to the position. But in DVOA, they rank 25th, which kind of tells us that they're not particularly good against defending the position. They just haven't had any of these matchups where Titans have been dominating them. So I do like the idea of Trey McBride about this week, particularly, it's going to be, we're not going to get Marquise Brown out there. Greg Dortch has had 12.5 PPR points and 15.2 PPR points in the last two games. I think you can take shots on him. But I would be completely fine playing this game, probably with Kyler Murray, Trey McBride, Greg Dortch, and then Kenneth Walker and at least one Seahawks pass catcher. I think that's something which I'll be running through the sims over the next couple of days, looking at how that plays out for some of the contests that I want to enter. Denver at Las Vegas. Neither team's got anything to play for here. It's Jarrett Stidham versus Aiden O'Connell. What are we doing? Denver, they'll have the second most fantasy points to running backs for most of the tight ends. Zamir White, he's had 67 touches for 336 yards, a touchdown in his last three games. There is no way Josh Jacobs is playing here. You're talking about a player who is playing on a slightly improved version of the franchise tag. Why is he going to come back after these last few games? It's playing hard. The Raiders are playing hard for Anthony Pierce. Devontae Adams, 21 targets in week 17. That kind of came out of nowhere. I think that at a push, you could play Devontae Adams. I would prefer to play Zamir White. I think that really this is a game where, okay, is Jaleel McLaughlin going to get a little bit more run? We know that Sean Payton likes to lean on his guys. So, yeah, there's not a whole lot of appeal here. Question in the chat, do either of these QBs start week one next year? No, I don't think so. I think maybe both of them end up in sort of camp competitions, with rookies or similar, but I don't think we've seen enough from either of them to really believe in them for next year. I know Rich might dive into that deeper in sort of one of his Dynasty episodes, but for me, it's not something I'd like to project forward. We'll move on. Dallas at Washington, 13-point favorites, the Cowboys, 46-point over-under. Dallas, they need the win. Lock at the 2 seed. It would be surprising if we don't see at least a half, 3/4 from the Cowboys starters. The Commanders, they allow the second most fantasy points to quarterbacks, fourth most to running backs, second most to wide receivers. You do whatever you want against the Commanders. Dallas, they've been good on the road. They seem to have been less good playing on grass on the road. And so, yes, they're going into Washington and will play on the grass, but I really can't see any situation where that's a problem for them. The one way that the Commanders could look to attack the Cowboys is on the ground. Brian Robinson back touches for the Commanders in week 17. And the Cowboys, we've seen them struggle with run a couple of weeks ago, James Cook. But I just can't believe that it's going to be a particularly good day for the Commanders here. I think we are in line to see Sam Howell again after he started against the Niners last week and did as Sam Howell does. Jahan Dotson held below 5.5 points in his last 4 games. If you had to start anyone, it's Terry McLaurin here, maybe Curtis Samuel, but really, I think you could look at going Dak, and you could go CeeDee Lamb, you could go Brandon Cooks, maybe Michael Gallup. The Commanders have actually been pretty good against the tight end position all year. They've allowed the 5th fewest fantasy points to them. So I'm not sure I would be starting Jake Ferguson, but all he really needs is a touchdown to get home in this one. One last game. Buffalo at Miami. I mean, this is what it's all about, week 18. There is so much on the line for this game. 49.5 over-under. So it won't be on the main slate of DraftKings games, but this is a game which you could attack in Showdown or some of the longer slates. And the winner of this game takes the AFC East and the second seed in the conference. So for the Bills, that would be a huge achievement given where they were 4, 5, 6 weeks ago. If Buffalo loses, they'd be eliminated unless the Jags lose to the Titans, as well as the Steelers losing to the Ravens. So really, the Bills A Miami loss, that'll put them, they'll still be in the playoffs. They've clinched, but it'll send them to Arrowhead for wildcard weekend, which probably isn't what they want to do. I think they'd much rather have teams come into Miami. In terms of the game itself, Miami ranked 29th against wide receiver ones. And the Bills absolutely need their wide receiver one to get going. Stephon Diggs, he's averaged 38 yards per game since week 10. Ali, Dynasty Grill, put it out on Twitter earlier today that since week 10, Stephon Diggs has been outscored by Quentin Johnston, which is insane, really. The Bills, the vibes, they're not good. Stephon Diggs, he's playing 66% of the snaps over the last 3 games, which if you're trying to get a player going, dropping his snap rate down below the kind of point where Gabe Davis or other players are playing, it doesn't really scream like you're really trying your hardest to get him the ball. They gave him a rush attempt inside the 5 last week. They gave all these shallow A dot targets because they're really desperately trying to make it happen for him. But do you trust Stephon Diggs? I think, there's always opportunity in murkiness like this, and I wouldn't mind taking shots on him as my captain in a DFS showdown lineup. Tyreek Hill, he's had no touchdown since week 13. The Bills have been really good against wide receiver ones all season. They rank 4th best overall against the position. So are we going to see Tyreek Hill come out and really light it up? He has an outside chance at sort of like really blowing things up and getting the records that he was after, but you're talking about 200 yards. When the 2 teams played in week 4, Tyreek Hill was held to 4 for 72, no touchdown, finishes the wide receiver 39. So, yes, the Bills are banged up in the secondary, but they've managed to hold him in check already this year. There are a lot of avenues in this game to disappointment, but I think it's one as a neutral that we can just sit back and enjoy. So that's kind of it for the Week 18 preview. If you have questions, if you have specific DFS questions, leave them in the comments. I'm going to get back to each and every single one of you. There are so many moving pieces on this week. It's not an easy slate, but there is opportunity in the ambiguity. If you're in the Discord, there are going to be many updates between now and Sunday. The updates are what matters. It's the people who are paying attention who are going to win money this weekend. And if you want to get in the Discord, hit the join button down below. We've got one simple plan there, and it's to help you make money. Been an awesome 18 weeks, but we've still got the playoffs. Keep subscribed to the channel. We're going to get you winning all the way through the Super Bowl.